4 o'clock in the morning, on the 30th of October, 2025, near the northern border of Burkina Faso, a quiet night was shattered when border guards spotted 27 trucks moving without headlights, trying to avoid the main road. At first, they thought it was just ordinary smuggling until the faint cries of women echoed from inside the locked cargo boxes. In that instant, the truth became clear. These were not goods, but lives in chains. The search began in silence. At first, the patrol believed it was only a smuggling convoy until they forced the trucks to stop. What they saw when the cargo doors swung open would be carved into their memories forever. Inside the first truck were women, 20 of them chained together with rough iron links. Their eyes told the story before any words were spoken: fear, exhaustion, and the desperate question of whether they would ever see the light of life again. The soldiers quickly realized this was not an isolated case. One truck followed another, each revealing the same horrifying scene. When the inspection ended, the truth could no longer be denied. 20 trucks carried women, about 20 in each. That meant more than 400 women were shackled. The remaining 7 trucks carried children, dozens upon dozens of terrified boys and girls, some no older than 6, their cries piercing the cold morning air. 3 smaller vehicles, used to scout ahead, were part of a sophisticated disguise meant to conceal this human cargo from the world. But under the pale dawn light, nothing could remain hidden. At that moment, the scale of the operation left the border guards stunned. This was not merely a crime. It was an organized network, a brutal marketplace of human beings. The reality stretched far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. It was a link in a chain of atrocities running from Central Africa to the Libyan desert and beyond. For the soldiers who made the discovery, there was no turning back. They had stumbled onto the front line of a hidden war, a war against dignity, against humanity itself. But this was only the beginning. What lay behind those trucks, and the names whispered by the captured drivers under interrogation, would soon expose an international web of corruption and betrayal. When the drivers were separated, the man behind the wheel of the lead truck finally broke under relentless questioning. His name was Moussa Diallo, 38 years old, from Gao, Mali, a neighboring country. He had been a truck driver almost all his life, hauling goods across the Sahel, yet now he trembled like a man who had just glimpsed his own doom. "I was told it was just cargo," he stammered. "They offered me $3,000. They said to drive north, to the Libyan border. I had no choice. I needed the money." His voice shook as he realized that what he had agreed to transport were not goods, but souls. Pressed further, Moussa admitted he had been contacted by a Libyan trader named Khaled al-Mansour. Khaled, he explained, was not the leader, just a broker, a link in a far larger chain. "There is another man," Moussa whispered, "a very powerful one. I don't even know his name. They only call him the Master. He's in the Middle East. We've never seen his face." That confession struck like thunder in clear skies. It proved that this convoy was not the random act of bandits. It was part of a transnational trafficking network, stretching from Burkina Faso through Niger, funneling desperate lives toward Libya, and from there into the black markets of Europe and the Middle East. The soldiers wrote down every word, realizing they were witnessing something far greater than a border violation. This was evidence of an empire of crime, an empire that thrived on the bodies of women and children. The scope of the network explained its precision: 27 trucks, 3 scout vehicles, cross-border coordination, and money flowing through foreign intermediaries. This was not mere criminality, it was a system operating with military efficiency. And hidden within Moussa's confession was the heavy scent of corruption, the trace of those who profited in silence. Yet even Moussa's shocking admission could not prepare the patrol for what was to come. For among the rescued was a young woman who carried not only scars, but the courage to speak. Among those freed was Aminata Ouedraogo, a 24-year-old from the village of Yako in northern Burkina Faso. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, yet her voice held a strength that silence could no longer contain. "I was taken at the market," she said, her tone trembling yet firm. "I was with my little sister. Men wearing masks and carrying guns blocked our path. They hit me on the head, and when I woke up, I was chained inside the truck." Around her, other women nodded, their stories written in bruises and hollow eyes. Aminata went on. We were barely given food or water. They told us to stay silent or be killed. There were at least 12 women and 7 children with me. I don't know where they took my sister. The soldiers listened, feeling the weight of every word. This was not just an incident, it was a human tragedy unfolding before their eyes. For every Aminata who survived, how many others had vanished into the dark current of human trafficking? As dawn broke, the cries of children grew louder, mingling with the clinking of chains being cut. It was a scene of pain, yet also defiance, for the once invisible now stood as witnesses. What Aminata revealed confirmed Musa's account. The trafficking route was meticulously organized, stretching through Niger, funneling lives toward Libya, then across the Mediterranean into Europe and beyond. The women were forced into hard labor, while the children were sold into markets so vile they defied description. And yet, amid the despair, her testimony ignited something greater. For the soldiers, it turned duty into purpose. For the government, it became a call to action. And for the people of Burkina Faso, it stood as proof that their homeland had become a battleground in a struggle touching the very soul of Africa. This discovery was no longer about trucks or smugglers. It was a story about the dignity of a violated nation and its unyielding will to rise against those who sought to strip humanity of its name. The investigation moved swiftly. What had begun as a nighttime discovery near the town of Dori soon revealed the full scope of a sophisticated exploitation network. Documents and phone data seized from the drivers showed numerous contacts linking to Dubai and Istanbul. Routes were redrawn through African news bulletins, and intelligence reports confirmed the same pattern: Burkina Faso, Niger, Libya, across the Mediterranean to Europe and the Middle East. This was not a coincidence of geography. It was the deliberate design of a transnational network. Women from rural villages were forced into labor camps or trafficked to European cities to serve the sex industry. Children, the most vulnerable victims, were sold into illegal adoption rings, or worse, to the haunting black markets of human organs. Every leg of the journey was another profit for the next broker, another silent hand taking its share in the shadows. The ruthless efficiency of the operation stunned investigators. Nearly 30 trucks could not have moved without protection. Someone had cleared the way, perhaps corrupt border officials, forged papers, or the silence of authorities who had already been bought. In a land already steeped in conflict and poverty, this empire of human trafficking had thrived precisely because of that chaos. For families in northern Burkina Faso, the consequences were devastating. Mothers no longer dared let their daughters go to the market. Fathers no longer trusted the roads that once connected their villages. Every disappearance became a wound in the social fabric, a reminder that security was now an illusion and their nation surrounded. International organizations quickly drew parallels with the crimes of the past. Many reports described it not merely as criminal activity, but as a form of modern slavery reborn under new flags and currencies. The fact that this was happening in the year 2025, in plain sight of governments and corporations, forced the world to face an uncomfortable truth. Corruption was no longer rumor but currency, and human life had become one of the most traded commodities on earth. And as the evidence mounted, a new question echoed. If such a network could flourish in Burkina Faso, how far did its reach extend across Africa? As the scale of the trafficking network became clear, shockwaves rippled through the villages and towns of northern Burkina Faso. Markets grew empty, schools saw fewer children, and entire communities lived under the shadow of fear. Women avoided traveling alone, even in daylight. Families whispered warnings to one another, knowing that the predators lurked not only in alleys, but on the very roads that once brought life and trade. The political fallout was immediate. Citizens demanded answers. How could nearly 30 trucks cross the border unnoticed? Who inside the system had helped them? The revelation ignited a storm of debate across African news broadcasts, where commentators called it a test of national sovereignty and a turning point for the Sahel. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was more than headlines. It was a bleeding wound in the heart of their homeland. The weight of response now fell upon President Ibrahim Traoré. Though only 30 years old, Traoré had become a symbol of resistance against exploitation from abroad. But now, the stakes were no longer gold or politics, they were human lives and the honor of an entire nation. Traoré immediately convened an emergency council, summoning ministers, generals, and village chiefs. His words were brief, but unyielding. Burkina Faso will never become a marketplace for the trade of human flesh. Those who conspire against our people will be punished, no matter how powerful they are. That declaration echoed across the Sahel, replayed on radio, printed in newspapers, painting the image of a leader willing to confront not only criminals, but the corrupt power networks shielding them. Yet every act of courage carries danger. The traffickers had money, weapons, and allies abroad. Challenging them meant risking assassination or overthrow. But Traoré's resolve ignited a fire among his people. Across villages, men volunteered to join local defense groups, while women's associations called for stronger protective measures. The crisis was no longer a police matter. It had become a national battle for dignity. And in that struggle, Ibrahim Traoré's role was not just that of a president, but of a symbol, the line between silence and justice, between fear and the proud future of Burkina Faso. The revelations in Burkina Faso soon crossed borders. Within days, news of the intercepted convoy appeared on international networks, spreading from African news to European and American television channels. The scale stunned the world. Nearly 30 trucks, more than 400 women, and dozens of children rescued from the jaws of modern slavery. Across Africa, the African Union, AU, issued an emergency statement, calling the case a stain on the conscience of humanity. They promised to send an investigation team, though citizens doubted whether slow-moving committees could keep pace with the speed of the traffickers' brutality. Still, the gesture carried symbolic weight. It made Burkina Faso the epicenter of continental politics. In Europe, reactions were more complex. Human rights organizations demanded accountability and protection for victims. Yet behind closed doors, politicians hesitated. Part of the market for human beings existed within Europe itself. Would they dare condemn a trade in which the buyers were their own citizens? In Washington, policymakers faced a difficult equation. The Sahel had long been viewed through the lens of counterterrorism, but the focus had now shifted. Human trafficking on this scale was not merely a humanitarian catastrophe, it was a global security threat, feeding migration, corruption, and regional instability. Some members of Congress called for closer cooperation with President Ibrahim Traoré, seeing in him a chance to strike at the roots of the crime. Others, wary of his independent stance, questioned whether he could be trusted. The American public, especially older generations who had lived through the civil rights movement, expressed outrage. How can this still happen in the 21st century? Became the question echoing through talk shows and community forums. Churches and humanitarian groups began collecting aid, seeing in the story of Aminata, one of the rescued victims, a reflection of the very struggle against slavery that once defined America's own moral history. Thus, the world entered a moment of reckoning. For the first time, the trafficking routes of the Sahel were no longer buried beneath diplomatic reports. They had become front-page news. And as the spotlight turned toward them, a new question emerged. Would the world stand with Burkina Faso or turn away once more? For the United States, the crisis in Burkina Faso carried deeper implications than many officials dared to admit. Human trafficking was not a distant issue. It was tied to migration routes, drug networks, and even funding for extremist groups. Ignoring it meant accepting a time bomb that could explode far beyond Africa. Strategists in the Pentagon quietly acknowledged that the Sahel was becoming the front line between order and chaos. If traffickers could operate a convoy of 400 women and children with military precision, what else could they transport? Weapons? Terrorists? The case was not just a moral outrage, it was a geopolitical warning. In Washington think tanks, analysts debated whether Ibrahim Traoré represented a risk or an opportunity. He had long unsettled the West with his independent policies, yet his decisive stance against trafficking demonstrated something rare in global politics: the will to fight corruption, even against powerful interests. One editorial observed, "If Africa gives birth to leaders who fight for human dignity, then we should stand with them even when they do not always stand with us." In Europe, the pressure mounted as well. Governments that had long benefited from migrant labor were now forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Human rights groups demanded sanctions on the networks complicit in the trade. African communities in Paris, London, and Berlin marched in protest, holding banners with Traoré's name and the faces of the rescued women and children. The world was watching, and this time, Its gaze was not upon Africa as a victim, but as a battlefield of justice, led by a new generation of leadership. At the center of that vision stood Ibrahim Traoré, a man whose choices would shape not only the fate of Burkina Faso, but the moral conscience of humankind. Yet just as investigators believed they had grasped the full picture, a new shock emerged. The convoy intercepted near Dori was not merely part of a small smuggling chain, but a fragment of a vast structure disguised under the banner of international commerce. Phone data and shipping documents revealed that many of the trucks had been leased under the names of legitimate transport companies, with offices not only in West Africa but also in Europe and the Middle East. On paper, they carried construction equipment, food, even medical supplies. In reality, the cargo was human beings. The revelation struck like lightning on a clear day. The problem was no longer about a few corrupt border guards or desperate drivers. It was proof that powerful economic corporations with international partners were shielding these crimes. Human trafficking did not merely survive in the dark. It was being fed by the very arteries of the global trade system. For the people of Burkina Faso, the discovery provoked a fury beyond measure. It meant that their children's suffering came not from bandits, but from men in suits, sitting in conference rooms in faraway capitals. And for the world, the illusion that slavery had ended shattered completely. It was still alive, thriving, profitable, and protected by layers of wealth and influence. In a single moment, the crisis transformed from a local tragedy into a global scandal, and at the heart of the storm stood the young leader, Ibrahim Traoré, forced to make a choice. Would he fight only the criminals, or dare to confront the hidden powers that had created them? Those revelations could have paralyzed any government. But in Ouagadougou, the reaction of Burkina Faso was immediate and decisive. President Ibrahim Traoré summoned his generals, intelligence chiefs, and community representatives to an emergency meeting. Only a few hours later, he announced the launch of Operation Freedom Sahel, a campaign not only to dismantle human trafficking routes, but to expose the high-level powers hiding behind corporate and diplomatic masks. Our people are not merchandise, Traoré declared. Burkina Faso will not bow to the networks that profit from chains and suffering. We will hunt them down across the desert, in the cities, and even in the grand halls of power. Let the world hear it clearly. Those who trade in human lives will face justice. His words spread across the nation like a current of electricity. On radio waves and in Africa news broadcasts, people described a rare feeling pride. In markets and mosques, in schools and on the streets, the name Traoré was spoken in a new tone reverence. He was no longer just a president. He had become a shield protecting Africa from those who had long treated the continent as their hunting ground. The risks were immense. Confronting traffickers linked to international corporations and foreign capitals meant inviting retaliation. But Traoré's resolve sent a message that crossed the borders of Burkina Faso. Africa would no longer remain silent while its sons and daughters were stolen and sold. In that moment, destiny reshaped the man himself. From a single patrol's discovery, a flame had been lit, one that transformed a leader into a symbol for an entire continent. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer merely governing. He had become the living embodiment of Africa's defiance. From the wind-swept borders near Dori to the corridors of power in Ouagadougou, the story of that convoy had grown beyond the limits of an investigative report. It had become a fateful chapter in the struggle of a people, the moment when silence was broken and chains were shattered. That morning, in September 2025, more than 400 women and countless children were pulled out of the darkness of despair into the light of freedom. They were no longer nameless numbers in a hidden trade. They became living witnesses that even in the darkest hour, courage can triumph when humanity dares to act. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was not merely a rescue. It was the rebirth of dignity, a declaration that their land would never again surrender to fear. Villages that once shut their doors at dusk now sang songs of unity. Families that had wept in silence realized that hope can grow again from pain itself. And for all of Africa, this story carried a deeper message. Freedom is never granted. It is not the gift of great powers, nor the favor of the corrupt. Freedom must be seized, defended, and lived fully by those who refuse to bow. On the international stage, the story echoed through African news reports and major newspapers around the world. It forced humanity to confront the shameful truth that modern slavery still exists, fed by greed and protected by silence. It posed a question to every nation, every community, every church. If it were our daughters, our sons, would we turn away? Amid the storm of global attention, President Ibrahim Traoré stood firm, unwavering. His voice rang out resolute and powerful. We do not need permission to be free. We have risen and taken it. Those words, spoken in Ouagadougou, have now echoed far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. They are repeated in markets, in schools, in churches, and among African communities in Paris, New York, and London. It is no longer just the defiant voice of one man. It is the promise of a continent rising to reclaim its rightful place in the world. Therefore, this is not the end of a story, it is the beginning of a journey. The convoy near Dori may have been stopped, but the greater battle is still unfolding. A battle for dignity, for justice, and for the right of every African child to grow up free from chains. The world often forgets that slavery did not vanish with history books, it merely changed its disguise. It hides in the shadows of poverty, in the greed of corporations, and in the silence of those who look away. But from that night on the northern border of Burkina Faso, something irreversible began. A spark ignited, a spark that turned pain into purpose, fear into strength, and despair into resistance. Across villages and cities, from the Sahel winds of Gorom to the crowded streets of Ouagadougou, people began to speak with one voice. Mothers told their children that freedom must never again be taken for granted. Teachers reminded their students that courage is not born in comfort, but in the willingness to stand when the world demands you kneel. And soldiers, the same men who found those trucks, now walk with a new sense of mission. They are not just defenders of borders, but guardians of human dignity. Because this struggle is not just Burkina Faso's, it belongs to every African heart that beats with the same unbroken rhythm, a rhythm of resilience, pride, and faith. What began as an act of rescue has become a movement of rebirth, and what started with one leader's courage has awakened the conscience of an entire continent. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré has touched your heart, do not remain silent. Silence is what keeps injustice alive. Speak out, share this story so that more people may understand what is truly at stake. Join us, subscribe, stand with us, and become part of this journey to witness a new Africa rise. Proud, united, and unyielding. Let the world see that Africa is not a land of despair, but a cradle of rebirth. Let the world remember that the sons and daughters of this continent will no longer bow before those who trade in their suffering. May God bless Burkina Faso. And may God bless all of Africa, the land of courage, the land of awakening, the land that still dares to dream of freedom.